You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
Welcome to this conversation on the human person. We have Dr. Ted Furton and the Reverend Dr. Kevin FitzGerald joining us in this conversation. To begin with, I'll read a brief introduction to Ted and Father Kevin, and then I'll invite Father Kevin to begin with a prayer. Dr. Ted Furton directs the staff of 3 who produce the National Catholic Bioethics Centre's many books and serial publications. He is founding editor of the award-winning journal, the National Catholic Bioethics Quarterly, and the longest-serving editor of Ethics and Medics, a monthly bulletin on moral issues in the health and life sciences. He received his master's and doctoral degrees in philosophy from the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C., and has taught at St. Charles Borromeo Theological Seminary in Philadelphia, La Salle University in Philadelphia, and Rockhurst University in Kansas City, Missouri. A member of the National Catholic Bioethics Center since 1997, he subscribes to the natural law theory of ethics and has written and spoken on many topics in bioethics, including stem cell research, reproductive technologies, vaccine use, brain death, organ donation, and physician-assisted suicide. Father Kevin FitzGerald is the John A. Creighton University professor and chair of the Department of Medical Humanities in the School of Medicine at Creighton University. He received 2 doctorates, a PhD in molecular genetics and a PhD in bioethics from Georgetown University. His research efforts focus on the utilization of the humanities in medical education, on the investigation of abnormal gene expression in cancer, and on ethical issues in biomedical research and medical genomics. He has published educational, scientific, and ethical articles in peer-reviewed journals, books, and in the popular press. Father FitzGerald has given presentations nationally and internationally, and has often been interviewed by the news media on such topics as human genetic engineering, cloning, stem cell research, and personalized medicine. He is a founding member of Do No Harm and a member of the Genetic Alliance, IRB. In addition, he has been a corresponding member of the Pontifical Academy for Life since 2005. Welcome, and we are here to discuss really the founding question: what is a human person? So if you would like to introduce this discussion with a prayer and then go to what you think are the first fundamental questions to be answered.
Thank you very much, Francis. And yes, let us take a moment and remember we are always in the presence of our Almighty Creator. So we thank you, Lord. We thank you for the invitation to love you and to love one another. We know we don't always respond as completely, as eagerly, and as committedly as we might. And so we ask your prayers upon our discussion today. We ask you to enlighten us, to lead us to the love that brings us all together within your embrace. And in deep respect for all the great religious traditions, we end our prayer in the name of our tradition, named after Jesus Christ, our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
It's Good. It'd probably take us only a few minutes to, solve what the question of the human person is. So I don't know what we'll do for the rest of the time, but I think it is a question that we have been wrestling with for several decades now, as advances in biotechnology and medicine have opened new avenues for intervention, both in terms of medical treatment, but also intervention in terms of trying to perhaps expand or even take our human nature in directions it has never gone before. And so it's extremely important for us to make sure that we're all talking about the same thing when we're talking about human beings, human nature, human personhood, because these are incredibly fundamental topics to these discussions on how to pursue the research and the expansion of our knowledge that we are so rapidly advancing, and also how to then implement that in terms of that caring for one another that we are called to do. So I look forward to our conversation today. I would even think we might start with that idea of what is it we think of when we think of being human. I'll just throw out a couple of interesting new developments that have come about in the last weeks, even months, but in the last years, certainly. The idea that most of us, if not all of us, there may be some groups in Africa where this is not true, but for most of the rest of us, we carry around DNA from Neanderthals and Denisovans, other human type species that we in the past have considered to be somewhat less than ourselves, in part because we survived and they didn't. But we obviously at one point interbred with them. What does that mean? Does that make us somehow different as humans, less than human, or just who we are? So those are kinds of the things that we're going to have to wrestle with as we look into this question of what is it we mean when we talk about being human and being a human person.
Francis, if I could just also make a couple of opening comments here.
Indeed.
In the grand scheme of things, with evolution, let's say Aristotle, the pre-Socratics go back to the beginning of intellectual life in the West to now is virtually a blink of the eye. The process is at a standstill from the larger picture. So I would go back to the early views of Aristotle and others from that period. I think they got it right when they talked about the human being as a rational animal. That's what sets us apart. It's what marks our species as a whole. It's a remarkable power that we possess. And by rational, I mean not only the reason, but also the free will. These are the things, the two attributes of us that set us apart from the animal kingdom, and in fact represent our image of God. God also being the divine reason and all-powerful, having will and goodness. Well, we should reflect that as well in our lives as human persons. So that would be my starting point for a discussion of this sort, that the human being is a rational creature, a rational animal, as Aristotle put it. We are animals as well, but it's that unique feature that sets us apart.
Thank you. So if we come then to the present, what defines the point of beginning for the human person as we ordinarily understand the conception of each one of us?
Well, I think this is a great question because it's extremely important, again, for us to be using these terms in the same way. So there are people who will say, for instance, that at the moment of conception, which is a somewhat interesting use of a sort of temporal adjective in terms of saying conception, as we know it from a scientific side, is a process, right? It is the merging of the gametes, the sperm and the egg, in a process. And we also know that the process does not necessarily always work. It doesn't always lead to the creation of a new human organism, being, human person. And so at exactly what moment in that process the new organism exists is something that is still, being debated and trying to be better understood. So perhaps what we could talk about is the process of conception leading to the creation, as we know it to be the case, because we're all here, of new human persons. So exactly then, if we can just say, okay, it's the process that does that, it doesn't always do it. Sometimes sperm and egg come together and you get something that's much more like a tumor. That's certainly not a human being. And we remove those tumors and nobody mourns the loss of those. So this is a very important understanding that we have to wrestle with, because in part, some people will argue the fact that sometimes when conception or something similar to conception happens and what is produced is lost, right? That means that, well, those embryos can't be of the same value and worth as the rest of us, because why would we lose so many? But I think what's lost in that discussion is the fact that we don't have a very precise idea of how many of those miscarriages come from something that occurred in that process that went awry. And so perhaps there was never a human organism there. Now, we also know, again, from a clinical reality, that human organisms, developing human persons, are lost in miscarriages. And that is a tragedy. But that's also part of that biological reality we all have to engage at some point, in the fact that we're limited, we're conditional, we are not going to live forever. And however long we live is however long we live. We try to do the best we can to live that life fully and extend it in a normal, healthy way. But sometimes it's just going to be a lot shorter than what we would hope.
I remember speaking with a man who was shocked by the amount of loss of early embryonic life. And for him, it was practically an objection to a theology. He didn't think that that could happen under the divine plan, but of course it does. That happens by way of nature, as Father Kevin is saying here. But the problem is that human beings want to do the same, bring embryonic life under their control and also dispose of it as they will. Concerning the moment of conception question, which I agree, finding a pinpoint moment in the process is one matter, but at the same time, a human being is a whole, can't be half present and half absent. Same thing happens at the end of life. We have the expression, he's half dead, or whatever, half dead with tiredness or whatever, but a person is either there or not there. So the departure of the soul and the entry of the soul into matter is the conferring of a whole person. And that certainly occurs very early on in the process of embryonic development. I would say within the first few minutes of the sperm contacting the ovum. I think Maureen Kondik has got an excellent white paper in this area where she goes into some detail on the process and is convinced that it's very early and very definite, because what happens is that the embryo begins to direct its own development. Mm-hmm. It's an independent agent. Not that it could survive on its own. Well, I'm not sure any of us could survive on our own. We need each other all the time. But once that whole is there, then I think we have the characteristic of reason also present. Now, that may sound surprising, but it's there in an incipient way. It's there as something meant to come to be in this particular type of creature, unlike other animals, a horse or a cow or whatever. that element is not present as a possibility from the beginning. So given that that is there from the beginning, we have the same type of human life as we have for those who are adults, and the same definition throughout the entire course of human life from beginning until natural death.
In the question of conception being a process, you could say it's indistinguishable except as a phase of development, because once begun, and a distinguishing fact of the beginning of conception is the closing of the embryonic wall, which almost acts like a skin of the human embryo. So from that point onwards, there is even what the Warnock report recognized as uninterrupted development. So in one sense, is it not a false distinction to say conception is different from the whole process once begun, which is continuous?
Absolutely. Yes. I mean, it's a continuous process, and those who want to turn to 14 days or some other marker, I guess they look at the beginning of the neural pathways at 14 days. But these are all continuous development, as you're saying, Francis. And if there's going to be a point when the human person appears, it has to be when that first union or closure of the sac, however it's described, occurs, and the process begins.
And I'm glad you brought up the issue of the 14 days or, other lines of demarcation that some people try to pick, right? Because they will say things like, well, we know, of course, that there are identical twins, and identical twins can come about because the embryo, as it is in this process of development, divides, and instead of staying together as one organism, becomes two. So, of course, then the questions arise, well, is the soul somehow split in half and all? But I think that is looking at the problem with the wrong kinds of understandings of these terms. So the idea that somehow a soul is similar sort of quantitatively, you have one biological entity, and so somehow that soul is matched to that. Again, we can have more of a discussion on how we understand that. I kind of like to bring in for people when they wrestle with that, the idea that part of our ensoulment is God's love bringing us into existence. And there's nothing that I can do to either make that happen or prevent that from happening. And so if during a process, a developing embryo happens to split into two and God embraces both, then both are in soul. And so at that moment, however, again, it is a process, but at whatever moment the two have become separate, individually developing organisms, human beings, human persons, they are both ensouled. Before that, there was only one. Now there are two. I think God can handle that. And so I don't have that problem of saying we need to come up with a different line of demarcation other than the process of conception for the start of a human organism.
Well, Father Kevin, you live in the world of science, so you're very familiar with the materialism that dominates the field. And you bring up the term soul, and within the Catholic tradition and within the ancient Greek tradition, the Western philosophical tradition more broadly, we are a unity of form and matter, soul and body. And within our tradition, it's the soul that gives life to the body rather than the other way around. And materialistic philosophy, which we live in daily and the scientific community holds to be fundamentally true, holds that life originates out of the matter. So they give excessive attention, I think, to the neural aspects, the 14 days, these sorts of things, as if that were definitive, not realizing that it's the soul which is fitted for the body, which really determines a human life and enlivens the body and causes it to move to completion.
So we already seem to have the principle that if there is a human body, it is ensouled, twinning being an example that you cannot have a human body without it being ensouled, whether it's ensouled at the first instant of conception or as an example of twinning. So is the converse true, that if there is no human body, there is no ensoulment?
Well, technically it's true, because you can't have a soul ensouling something without something to be ensouled. And that sounds like something of a paradox or whatever. But there is the interesting question in Aquinas about the soul separating from the body at the end of life and its status apart from the body before the resurrection. There is some sort of passage to a new world, to an afterlife, which takes place immediately. I've heard some people say, no, I guess we just fall asleep, or, you go into nothingness, and then at the resurrection, the soul comes back to life and inhabits a body. Aquinas has an interesting discussion of this. The soul that continues to exist, it wants to be with its body, it will be, but in the interim, you have a soul which is not in a body, and yet exists by the grace of God and is directly infused with what he'll call phantasms, which are the products of sensation. And these are directly given to the intellect by God himself. So we continue to live after death without a body. So a long-winded answer to your question, I guess the answer for me would be, yes, it is possible to have a soul without a body.
And again, I mean, and Francis, you've made some of these points in the materials that you've written. We often, too, have to remember that the conversations that Aristotle and Thomas and others were having were based on a certain concept of biology and even physics. So the concept, again, of embodiment, right? What do we say when we say something is embodied? Well, normally, of course, we think about ourselves and the flesh that we have and the ways in which we currently are embodied. But that is not to say that there couldn't be other ways of embodiment that would still be something fitting to human nature. So, of course, if we want to get into science again, the idea is now that we know, unlike Aristotle, who thought matter was sort of immortal and, prime matter was kind of just there, we also know that matter and energy are interchangeable. So from that perspective, embodiment doesn't necessarily have to mean a body like this. It could be more of a state of energy of some sort and kind. Now, the other thing we have to always keep in mind is that while God certainly is as immanent in us as could possibly be, and even more so than we are aware ourselves, God is also outside of space and time because God created space and time. So there are probably other means of embodiment that are available to God that we haven't even begun to consider. So I wouldn't worry too much about saying if we die and this particular physical phase of my existence no longer functions in that integrated whole organism, as we've talked about before. That doesn't mean that my integrated wholeness as a human person has to therefore no longer be able to exist. I'm pretty sure that God can come up with ways, and I'm not going to predict what those are going to be, and I'm not one either to try to say what the resurrection is going to look like. But again, I don't have much concern over the fact that even from a very fundamental scientific perspective, we can acknowledge that we have little idea of the myriad ways that God could continue to embrace us and love us, even if we are no longer in this particular physical form.
Okay, this introduces the question of what is it to exist? If we exist, okay, we could take the contrast between Aristotle, who had this notion of everlasting matter that was then changed. If you introduce a creator, is he not going to create as a whole? and therefore the existence of a person is going to be quite different because it's conceived as a whole in its very existence. What do you think the difference in this perception arises because of a creator?
I think the idea that, again, and this is something, and I've had these discussions, it's fascinating to have these discussions with physicists and all, because they can get that sense of before time, right? Because the Big Bang and all that, and what happened before, and we had space-time, and then before that, there was what? So when we have these conversations, if God created space-time, then all of space-time is present, in a sense, non-temporally, to God, which means we are all present in our whole existence, as you just said, Francis, to God. And so, again, our claiming to be able to not just know exactly how all that is encompassed, but even be able to then say that we should take control of that, and we should be the masters of that. It's just such a ridiculous idea when one considers the magnitude of what one is talking about. The hubris is just so incredible. Instead, I think we just need to spend maybe every moment of our lives just continually amazed that we're here and all of this is here with us.
Francis, I'm not sure the distinction you made originally there was one that is accurate, because Aristotle considered the human person to be a whole as well. Yeah, prime matter in his philosophy never exists without form. It's kind of an odd sort of status, not real and yet not completely unreal. Anyway, and during the Middle Ages, of course, Aristotle's philosophy was incorporated into Catholic Church, Catholic philosophy, Catholic theology, and same ideas. As there was a melding, really, of Aristotelianism and Thomism. There's still the hyphenated word, an Aristotelian Thomist, which is, a label I would be happy to wear. And that time, the idea of creation was of an eternal creation. So the medievals also thought that the universe had always existed. And in fact, when I was in Catholic grade school, I can remember going to the library there. And as you know, books in Catholic libraries are always 10 or 15 years out of date. So there was, I picked up a book and it talked about, the steady state theory. This is how the universe has existed, always will exist. It's just always been here, and matter has always been subjected to form. And it wasn't until Georges Lemaitre came up with the idea of the atomic particle that explodes and gives rise to a process of evolution. Lemaitre being a Catholic priest, that we had this first inklings of an idea of the evolution of the cosmos. So we've made an adjustment based on these findings, but I don't think it really changes the basic idea, as Father Kevin is saying, that God is looking at the whole of creation all at once. We're all present to him. And, we live in a theological framework where God is still outside space and time. So not much has changed, I think, in the bigger picture, the two main components, creation and the creator.
Okay. If we say there's a convergence then between this Aristotelian Thomistic philosophy and our present understanding of there being an existence that has a point of departure, if God is involved, can we in some way access the perception of God through revelation of what he has done when he has given us existence?
Well, as I sometimes say to people, if you want a proof for God's existence, go to the Wikipedia page and read the first several paragraphs of the Big Bang Theory. I mean, it's so incredibly complex. I mean, it's just, as Father Kevin was saying, the wonder of existence is astonishing, and how it comes about is astonishing. And anyone who says that science is solving all the problems and simplifying things has got it completely backwards. Science is just showing how tremendously complex the world is. Talking before about, Father was saying about energy fields and the like. I mean, we've discovered other planets which are Earth-like. Perhaps there are other rational creatures there who do have significantly different forms of embodiment.
Well, can we make the discussion back to the beginning of the human person? Is revelation, the word of God, a help to understanding what God has done in bringing each one of us to exist?
So that you bring up a great point, and I think this is something that you discussed in your treatise on conception, and this idea that there are other ways to look at these situations outside of just perhaps the physical scientific perception. And I think, as Ted was just mentioning, even if one looks within a scientific perspective, there's that discussion, that debate about properties and their actual presence in material reality. And the idea that perhaps if one looks at all of reality just on the level of physics, one cannot predict or even know what is going to happen when one moves to the level of chemistry, or from chemistry to biology, to life, or life to sociology and psychology, the mind, right? And so if one accepts that sort of what's often called emergent property, whether it's epistemological or ontological, then one has to acknowledge the possibility that other ways of looking at things are going to be extremely important for us to understand them as that complexity unfolds. And so I think when one thinks about it in that regard, there is no way of knowing that's available to us that would not be helpful in enriching our understanding. And so certainly one would also want to look at the idea of the arising of a new human being from both a theological perspective, even a spiritual perspective, and a philosophical perspective, in sense of what is the amazing miracle that's happening before us. Yes, of inordinate complexity, even just merely on the biological level. But think again how rich the complexity is if one brings in also a theological, religious understanding.
Yeah, the revelation, of course, is tremendously important for us as Catholics. But I hope I don't seem like a stick in the mud here, Francis, but I don't think it's a great avenue for reaching out to the world, because not everyone accepts the Catholic faith or our understanding of revelation or the Immaculate Conception. These are vitally important for us as Catholics, and they add to what, our understanding of embryonic development and the moment of conception and the like. But faith is added to reason, and reason has the advantage of being able to speak in universal categories and engage with science and make use of the facts of science as well to advance its reasoning in a way that should appeal to all rational creatures. And I think it therefore has the potential to be more persuasive for those who are not Catholics, for the general population, which unfortunately for us, given frankly the decline of Christianity over the course of the centuries, which we see continuing to this day, although there are many great faithful Catholics and Christians around the world, it still struggles. And those who have power and in the political and the scientific and the financial fields, they're not, unless they're already born and raised a Christian, they're not likely to find our appeals to revelation all that persuasive in the areas we're talking about here, in the question of what the human person is, how that person begins and what the death of the person, how we recognize that. Those are questions that really go beyond, I think, revelation to help to connect with.
Although, if I could throw in just one experience that I had, which I found, for me anyway, revelatory. I was in China at a meeting, and at one point in time, was able to sit down with some graduate students. And you can well imagine, as Ted was mentioning, right, Christianity was not high on their list of areas from which they had received any knowledge, but they were fascinated with the idea of a personal God, because from their Taoist perspectives or their other perspectives that they had a little bit more awareness of, that just wasn't there. And for them, that possibility was so intriguing that instead of sitting there and talking about science as one would have expected we would all do, they wanted to talk about, what does it mean to be part of a faith community that has a personal relationship with the Creator? And that for them was fascinating. So I agree. I mean, the connections aren't necessarily going to be easy, and they're certainly not going to be at the level of sophistication that we might be able to discuss among the three of us. But just those early kinds of questions and ideas, that additional layer of meaning that can come out of that sort of investigation on the part of these students. I have no idea where that went in their lives, but I'm just sort of hopeful that it perhaps in some way planted a seed for them to be able to then even just consider going forward that this other way of looking at things might have some benefit for them to engage in and to continue to try to understand.
What about the principle of relationship then? If we take relationship as a key term of what it is to be a person, the child who comes to exist is a son or a daughter, a grandchild or a nephew or a niece. And so, even in epigenetics, there is an interaction between the child in the womb, the embryonic child, and the mother. It's not as if, you will know better than I, but there is an interaction, a genetic interaction. So relationship does seem to be a possible common term for opening the discussion.
Oh, and again, an area, as you've just mentioned, that has just exploded in the last 20 years. And in ways, again, that are both very physical, sort of in their impact. So, for instance, the idea that we know now, or at least we have evidence now of the fact that women who were in the Benelux area, so Luxembourg, Belgium, and the Netherlands, during the initial Nazi occupation, when food was scarce, the children that were born during that time and their children have a higher proclivity to type 2 diabetes than children that weren't born during those times of food scarcity. Same woman, same parents, same culture, same everything. So that experience in the womb that the fetus had of the nutritional scarcity not only impacted the metabolism of that child, but also that person's children. So we can now say, obviously, relationality is exceptionally important. Where we're just starting to scratch the surface is, well, there's many ways in which even just our thoughts can impact our physical bodies. One of the things I like to sometimes tease the medical students with is to come into a class and say, oh, by the way, we're going to have a quiz during this class, and it's going to count for half of your grade. And then you just wait a few seconds and say, okay, now, did I touch anybody? Did I add anything to your drink? Did I put anything in the air? But I guarantee you, your cortisol levels just went through the roof. So I can impact you. And by the way, those high cortisol levels can have an epigenetic effect. So I have to make sure that I don't make it last very long. But the idea is, of course, relationality. I mean, even from a scientific perspective now, we know that relationality is of utmost importance and part of very much who we are.
Yeah, just
Come in there, Ted.
yeah, to broaden it somewhat here, I think what your question points to, Francis, as well, is the natural basis of morality are made for relationality. We are made to live in societies. We are born into families, and these are crucial to our moral lives and our health, our, a quest for happiness in life through hopefully a virtuous life that understands the difference between good and evil and works to achieve the good for ourselves and those whom we love. This is part of the entire creation, the teleological order of nature. Telos being end, of course, and logos, science or reason. Same thing shows up within the social and political order. Again, the old contract theories presume, they go all the way back again to Plato and the Republic, that we need each other, and so we come together and form agreements to live in harmony with each other and to keep those who cannot live by the light of reason, who harm other people, break the unwritten laws of nature. We agree to join together to preserve our society and work together for our greater good in all the ways that we do. And of course, society has made tremendous progress, especially in modernity, in the areas of medicine and technology and communications. These have been phenomenal. But I do think it's fair to say that we're suffering some serious relational deficits within the family, which has been breaking down badly, and in the social order, which we see rise in crime and other problems. Nature is the standard, is the point I want to make here. And we're called to pursue the natural goods as God has made them evident to us in the world around us. And when we ever forget that and we start creating our own world, our own morality that we think we can impose on nature and change what is good and evil and the purposes of nature, then we begin to falter and suffer decline.
Can we press the definition of person then to bring out its, to use the language, its relation to relationship? Person isn't a word that simply arose. We use it very commonly now, but in its origin, would you say that there is more about relationship in the origin of the term person than is perhaps currently understood?
May you speak etymologically, Francis, or?
Well, I was thinking, for example, I know it's going back to the councils of the church, but the term person came into philosophical use from a theological starting point, did it not?
And I think that it too, as you pointed out, has evolved in its understanding over time, right? So that currently, and again, this would be different places in the world, right? Because different cultures see this differently, but certainly in the United States, and I believe also in the United Kingdom, there's an aspect of personhood that has been emphasized recently: autonomy, self-legislation, right? Sort of self-creation. That has, in a sense, depreciated or minimalized the relationality part, other than to say, I fulfill myself or I make myself, right, in juxtaposition to others, rather than I cannot be fully who I am without full relationship with others. And so I do think, in that sense, you're getting at a very important dynamic in terms of the way even the word person is being used. Because again, it's one of those things that gets applied in multiple ways, and people will say, well, the embryo cannot be a person. And then they give an argument that's a legal argument or a moral argument that has nothing to do with the biology of a developing organism and the sort of ontological reality that's there. But again, it gets conflated. But I do think there's a fundamental idea that you bring up, that relationality piece, that we are kind of all in this together. In spite of the fact that, as Ted has pointed out, we're certainly operating out of that kind of approach these days, but it is a sort of reality that is there and that sort of defines us. Yeah.
Yeah. You're touching upon the essence of the Christian life really here, because service to others is, I would say, the heart of the Christian message from the point of view of action, caring and serving for others, which again is a further extension of the natural tendency we have to be related to each other, and say that Christianity is the perfection of that natural drive, to do unto others as you would have them do unto you, but even to go beyond that and care for those who don't care for you. So that's a furthering of the faiths. And one of the challenges I think we face today about the human person and the respect for the human person is we don't have the proper natural foundation to begin with. And if you don't have the natural foundation, it's hard to erect the Christian message on any sort of stable area. There's nothing there for you to move forward from. So, Ken, I guess I'm going to go back to saying what I said before about we need to rehabilitate kind of natural philosophy and natural law ethics and natural theology as well, if we want to have a chance of effectively spreading the Christian message, because I do think the Christian message rests on that natural foundation.
I'm thinking of a Chinese scientist I read about who, to all intents and purposes, as far as I know, was an atheist. But in the presence of frozen embryos, he could not destroy them. There was a kind of perception that he was making of the frozen embryo that was in his care that prohibited simply destroying them. Would you like to comment on this kind of nascent perception?
Was that Yamanaka, Father Kevin?
Yeah, it was. It was a Japanese scientist. Yes.
Sorry. Okay.
Yeah.
Japanese scientist.
Yeah, but he's famous for having come up with induced pluripotent stem cells. And someone was asking him what motivated him, since we already had this idea of cloning, somatic cell nuclear transfer, which of course involved the destruction of embryos. And that was his answer. That was part of the motivation.
Yeah, I think, Francis, you might be thinking of the other scientist, this one from China, who performed the genetic therapy experiments on children and then had them brought to term. He was, I think, imprisoned by the Chinese government. He
was recently released, Dr. He. And there was, I believe, a segment on NPR just recently about him trying to get back into, again, looking into more genetic modification of embryos, although I guess he's going to go more slowly this time.
I hope so, for his own welfare. But it is surprising to see the Chinese take such a stand. I don't know if it was on moral principles or just fear of being rejected by the scientific community. And the Yamanaka story is also wonderful because, Francis, as you're saying, this is a man who just knew on a natural level what he was looking at in those petri dishes. These are human beings. They could be my daughters, and I can't just throw these into the sink and wash them down.
So what kind of perception do you think that is? To be able to, in the first place, it's a very open-hearted perception. We speak of human beings being rational, but this sense of relationship seems to be more than, as it were, reason unadorned.
Well, here's what I would say to that, Francis. Our intellects are geared toward grasping the good within nature. The goods in nature appear as purposes. goals or teleological endpoints that God has put there as the aim of human action. So when Yamanaka is looking at these embryos, his intellect is grasping a natural good and recognizing that goods need to be protected, especially goods of this magnitude. So I think that the power of the intuition is what Aquinas would call it. We've got intuition, judgment, and reasoning, the three steps of the mind in thinking. The power of intuition is in many ways the most interesting because it's what enables us to see and identify the good. Now, that's rational, but one might say that there's something mystical about it. I could see where someone would think that. But again, I would put that in the area of reason and say it's a natural intuition that any human being can have.
And it also raises then the question of if this person who readily acknowledges, this is how this arose in his life, and it wasn't necessarily informed by any concrete and identifiable sort of faith or religious input. Why then is that not felt by everyone? And then I think we get into, again, the complexity of the human condition and the fact that people are impacted by relationality and have experiences in their lives that have pushed them in a different direction, perhaps away from that perhaps instinctual, intuitive reaction to a reaction that says, yes, but due to this experience that I've had or this awareness that I have been given by someone else, I am going to conclude that in spite of those perhaps intuitive or instinctive relational responses, I am going to choose a different interpretation or a different way to go in that regard. So I think that's where it's important for us to then be able to engage, again, being who we are from our perspective. As we've all mentioned already, we are called to care for all people, those that agree with us and share our faith, and even those who think that we should be removed from the face of the earth, and reach out to them to understand better why it is that you have chosen to look at things the way you have. And is there a way that we can get back to perhaps even a more extensive rehabilitation that Ted has been talking about, in allowing everyone to be able to then come back to very fundamental agreement on human relationality, the importance of human relationality, the impact of human relationality, and the ways in which then we have to make sure, to the best of our ability, that that relationality is crafted in a way that will benefit all people. So it's very interesting when you go to these meetings and people are debating, what we should do with human embryos and this, that, and the other thing. If you ask the question, should we help all people who need help? The immediate answer by everybody is, oh, of course, right? Because first of all, no one's going to say in public, no. So there's that pressure. But in any case, that's supposedly something we all agree on. Well, if we all agree on that, then we should be able to move from there to saying, well, why do you not consider these people to be related to us and only those people?
One of the women who wrote to me said she worked in the in vitro fertilization industry, and she then became pregnant herself. And she saw suddenly a discrepancy between processing data that belonged to human embryos suddenly had a personalization about it through her experience of becoming pregnant. So there was a dichotomy, if you like, that this human embryo wasn't seen as a personal entity, but suddenly became so as soon as she became pregnant herself.
Yeah, interesting observation on her part. Is she still working there, Francis?
No, she resigned from her position. And in fact, she took up a ministry of helping with the burial of human embryos.
Well,
So touched her.
yes. Well, there's also the possibility of divine inspiration in these cases. But, when it's your own flesh and blood and you relate to that of others, flesh and blood, even in the earliest stages, yeah, it can change minds. Yeah, but I would, following up on what Father Kevin was saying, the people fail to see what is the case because of ideological blinders, because they have suffered from poor education, because of pride. There's all sorts of factors, and it's an interesting question. How do you get people to move beyond that in a more general way? Individual instances, such as the ones we're talking about here, are very striking, but they're pretty much one-offs.
Many aspects of the discussion often draw on a woman's experience. Do you think there is a help to this discussion that comes particularly from being a man or a father in terms of recognizing relationality or the existence of a human person?
Well, marriage is a great good, and one of the fundamental purposes of nature. I mean, all animals and plants as well have ways of mating, but the human being enters into the realm of the intellect and the emotional and spiritual life in a way that no other creature can. So again, I would go back to the theme that if marriage were to be rehabilitated within our society and its proper parameters respected, instead of it being constantly attacked by activists of one sort or another, we would be in a better position for understanding the importance of embryonic human life and protecting it, because there'd be more parents or support between husband and wives in a more cohesive society that could, as it were, from the ground up, influence these questions rather than from the technological experts and politicians down, tell us what we should be doing or shouldn't be doing.
And I think, again, there's evidence to this effect that one can talk about, from a more scientific perspective, and I can't obviously talk about the benefits of marriage from a personal perspective, but I can say that there is, I think, again, as we've been talking about, something built into us, right? And both probably from a biological perspective, but I think even more from that relational perspective. When another person's life and the formation of that life is in your hands, that engenders in one additional motivation to be caring, to be loving, to be gentle, to be kind, to be supportive, to try to take this life that is in your hands in that sense and have it become all that it can be, have it be completely fulfilled. And so parenting, I think, is a tremendous experience that I've seen. I mean, you can see what happens to our medical students. You can see what happened to residents and fellows when they become parents for the first time, and how that can even change the way that they interact with their patients and with their colleagues and things like that. So it is an extremely powerful experience. Yeah. And
well said, Father. Well said.
I'm not sure at all that it should be surprising that it changes people's perspectives to that degree. Yeah.
100% agree with you on that.
I was thinking about, in becoming a father, there's a certain vulnerability in acknowledging this. Do you think this is part of the problem men have in acknowledging their fatherhood, that there is a vulnerability that comes with it?
Absolutely. No, I mean, it is life-changing to become a father. And for an unmarried man, and we're seeing many more of these today, life is very different. I mean, men by nature tend to be stronger, more prone to depression, And these are good qualities when they're properly harnessed within society. And one of the great bridles is marriage. And again, it changes people. It changes men so completely. It also changes women. I mean, they too become very different. I mean, I'm the father of 5, and one of the things, and I've got grandchildren now, and one of the things that I see when I especially look at my grandchild is the long distance future of our society. I think about that in a way that I didn't before as a grandparent. Even when I'd had my own children, it was more short distance. Now my vision is even further, and I can care more broadly about society as the whole and the future of our country and humanity.
Our hour is now up. Father Kevin introduced a discussion with a prayer. Would you, Ted, like to conclude it with a prayer?
I will just say my favorite short prayer. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be. Amen. Father, Son, Amen. Holy Spirit.
And thank you for this fascinating discussion.
Thank you very much. Thank you both.
Thank you for having us, Francis. Enjoyed it.
Bye-bye.
God bless.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
Thank you for listening to a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up when knowledge takes flight.